On the afternoon of March 18th, 1980, a 51-year-old furniture company employee named John Favara finished his shift at a factory in New Hyde Park, New York, got into his car, and drove the 13 miles home to Howard Beach, Queens, through traffic he had driven 1,000 times before. He did not come home from that drive. What happened on that specific afternoon, on a street he drove every day, was not something he could have prevented. A 12-year-old boy rode a borrowed mini bike out from behind a construction dumpster and into the path of his car at a moment when the setting sun made the blind spot in front of that dumpster impossible to see. The police investigated and found nothing wrong with his driving. No charges were filed. Frank Gotti's death was ruled an accident. John Favara was the back fence neighbor of John Gotti, the man who would become the most famous mob boss in American history. He was 51 years old, not involved in organized crime, cleared by the police of any wrongdoing, and trying to move his family out of Howard Beach before the end of July. The closing on his house was scheduled for July 31st. He disappeared on July 28th. The story of what happened between March 18th and July 28th and what happened to John Favara after the van drove away is one of the most disturbing illustrations in the history of American organized crime of what it means to live next door to the wrong family on the wrong street. Drop where you are watching from in the comments below. It is one of the best parts of putting these together. And if you are new here and want more history like this, hit subscribe now. Back to Howard Beach, Queens in the spring of 1980, and the ordinary man who drove home from work into a story he could never have anticipated. Howard Beach in 1980 was a middle-class neighborhood in Queens, bounded on one side by the Belt Parkway and on another by Jamaica Bay, a community of modest single-family homes where working families lived close together and where the proximity to organized crime was not an abstraction. It was a neighborhood where certain names carried certain meanings, and where people who lived on the relevant streets understood what those meanings were without anyone needing to explain them. John Favara was born on March 4th, 1929. He lived on 86th Street with his wife Janet and their two adopted sons. He worked as a service department manager for Castro Convertibles, a furniture company at a factory in New Hyde Park on Long Island, approximately 13 miles from Howard Beach. He commuted to work and back through the same streets every day. He had no criminal record and no involvement in organized crime. His adopted son Scott was a close friend of John Gotti Jr. and had spent nights at the Gotti home on multiple occasions. The two families were back fence neighbors in the specific sense. Their houses on adjacent streets backed up to each other. They were not close friends, but they were not strangers. They shared the proximity that a Queens neighborhood creates between people who live on adjacent blocks. Favara did have one connection to the world his neighbor inhabited. He was a childhood friend of Anthony Zappi, whose father, Ettore Zappi, was a capo regime in the Gambino crime family. Ettore Zappi was a distant cousin of the family's longtime patriarch, Carlo Gambino. Favara and Anthony Zappi had grown up together. Favara had chosen a legitimate path. Zappi had not. The two remained close despite that difference. This connection meant Favara knew enough about the world across his back fence to understand, in some degree, what the name on that fence meant. The Gotti family on 85th Street, directly behind the Favara home, was led by John Gotti, who in March of 1980 was a captain in the Gambino crime family. He had been released from prison in July of 1977 after serving time connected to the James McBratney manslaughter conviction, had been formally inducted as a made man shortly after his release, and had taken over the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club crew in Ozone Park under the sponsorship of underboss Aniello Della Croce. He was not yet the tabloid figure he would become. He had not yet become the boss, but in Howard Beach the neighborhood knew who he was. Frank Gotti was the fourth child of John and Victoria Gotti, born in 1968, 12 years old, in March of 1980. He was a normal 12-year-old by every account, a good student, passionate about sports, happy in the neighborhood with his friends. He did not know the details of what his father did. The world he inhabited was the world of school and the street and the neighborhood kids. And on the afternoon of March 18th, 1980, Both families were doing what they did on ordinary Tuesday afternoons. Frank Gotti was outside with his friends, and John Favara was driving home from work. March 18th was a Tuesday, and Frank Gotti had spent most of it trying to stay calm about the news he had received that day. He had made the football team. He was so excited for practice the following day that he spent the afternoon outside with his neighborhood friends. His older sister Victoria had seen him riding a mini bike around the neighborhood while she was walking out of a McDonald's nearby and had reminded him to be home for dinner at 5 in the evening. She went home. He kept riding. The mini bike belonged to a neighborhood boy named Kevin McMahon, who was allowing friends to take turns riding it. When it was Frank's turn, Frank got on the bike before McMahon finished explaining how to handle it. He rode out immediately. The specific location was 157th Avenue near 87th Street in Howard Beach. A house on that block was undergoing renovation. A construction dumpster was parked at the curb in front of the renovation site, directly creating a blind spot for any driver approaching the intersection from the west. Frank Gotti rode the mini bike into the street from behind that dumpster and into the blind spot it created. John Favara turned onto 157th Avenue from Cross Bay Boulevard and drove directly into the glare of the setting sun. The sun was dropping in the west, directly in his line of sight. He could not see past the glare and could not see past the dumpster's blind spot until he was past it. By then, Frank Gotti was in the street in front of him. Favara struck the boy. What the police investigation established. Favara told officers he was momentarily blinded by the sun and did not see the boy. The investigation confirmed this account as consistent with the physical conditions at the scene. No evidence of intoxication was found. No criminal charges were filed. Frank Gotti's death was ruled accidental, a determination that the investigation supported and that no subsequent legal proceeding overturned. The Gotti family offered a different account. Victoria DiGiorgio, Frank's mother, claimed Favara had been drunk and speeding. The daughter Victoria Gotti wrote in her memoir that Favara had continued driving after hitting Frank, dragging the boy approximately 200 feet before neighbors stopped the car by banging on the windows and climbing on the hood. These are the family's accounts, attributed to Victoria Gotti's memoir and to DiGiorgio's later statements to detectives and reporters. The police investigation, conducted within hours of the accident, did not confirm the drunk driving claim. The record on the 200 feet figure comes from the family's account. What is documented without dispute, neighbors intervened to stop the car. Frank was extracted from beneath it. He was alive when the ambulance came. He died at the hospital. John Gotti, who was not at the scene, went to the hospital when he was called. Victoria Gotti, the daughter, later wrote that her father said he was afraid for the first time in his whole life while sitting in the hospital waiting room, and that doctors had waited for him to arrive before telling him Frank had not survived. No charges were ever filed against John Favara. The investigation was closed, and in the house on 85th Street, the process of grief and something that traveled alongside it had already begun. John Gotti appeared, in the days following his son's death, to be a man undone by grief in a way that nothing in his professional life had prepared him for or could address. Victoria DiGiorgio collapsed into a grief so severe that it touched the edges of self-destruction. She broke a mirror and tried to cut herself. She later attempted to take pills. Gotti called a doctor who sedated her. For weeks after the funeral, she dressed only in black. In the living room of their home, a photograph of Frank was hung above a backdrop of candles and flowers. A Queens detective who later saw it called it a shrine. Frank Gotti's funeral was heavily attended. A local priest advised Favara not to make an appearance. FBI agents, who routinely maintained surveillance at mob-connected wakes and funerals to photograph the attendees, chose not to attend out of respect for the death of a child. 2 days after the accident, an unidentified woman called the 106th Precinct and said the driver of the car that killed Frank Gotti would be eliminated. That same day, Favara found a written death threat in his mailbox. On March 23rd, a detective visited the Favara home specifically to warn him about the phone threat. Favara's response, documented in the account of that visit, "That kind of stuff only happens in the movies." He continued going to work. He continued living in the house. The threats kept coming. On April 13th, 1980, Favara's car was stolen from in front of his home. It was found abandoned approximately 2 weeks later, less than a mile away. The car had not been repaired since the accident. The blood from March 18th was still on it. On May 1st, a funeral card from Frank Gotti's services was placed in Favara's mailbox. The following day, a photograph of Frank Gotti was placed in the mailbox. On May 22nd, Favara left his home and found the word murderer spray painted on his car in large letters. One day after Frank Gotti's funeral, Kevin McMahon, the neighborhood boy whose minibike Frank had been riding, came to the Gotti home and knocked on the door. Victoria DiGiorgio answered it. McMahon asked who would pay for his broken bike. The details in the Gotti family's account and carries the specific quality of a grief that compounds itself. A grieving mother, 5 days after burying her 12-year-old son, at the door with a boy asking about money for the bike her son died on. Victoria DiGiorgio's later statement to detectives included a list of Favara's failures. He never sent a condolence card, he never apologized, he never even got his car fixed. Whether these were the actual reasons the campaign against him continued, or whether they were justifications for what was going to happen, regardless of anything Favara did, is not answerable from the available record. On May 28, 1980, Victoria DiGiorgio encountered John Favara near his home and attacked him with a metal baseball bat. All sources confirmed the date and the fact of the attack. He was treated at a local hospital. He declined to press charges. John Gotti arrived at the scene and, by one account, silently brought his wife home. DiGiorgio returned after Gotti was asleep and went to Favara's car, still unrepaired, still blood-stained, and destroyed it with the bat. Favara shouted at her about the damages. After the hospital, Favara went to Anthony Zappi for advice. Zappi was the childhood friend whose father had been a Gambino capo, the one person in Favara's life with a direct understanding of the organizational world he had been living next to. Zappi's advice was direct and without ambiguity. Move out of the neighborhood immediately and get rid of the car. Every time Victoria DiGiorgio saw the unrepaired car on the street, it was a provocation. Leave. Favara took the advice finally and put his home on the market. A buyer was found. The legal paperwork was prepared. A closing date was scheduled for July 31st, 1980. He would be out of Howard Beach by the end of July. The process was in motion. The timeline was set. After the baseball bat, after the hospital, after Anthony Zappi's advice, John Favara had the paperwork in motion and the closing date on the calendar, and he continued driving to work every day in the same car, in the same neighborhood, waiting for the date to arrive. On July the 25th, 1980, John and Victoria Gotti left Howard Beach for a family vacation in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Gotti later told reporters and detectives that he had taken his grieving wife south to get some rest and to help her mind off things. The family produced hotel receipts confirming their presence in Florida on the relevant dates. The departure was 3 days before Favara's disappearance. It was 6 days before the scheduled closing on Favara's house. John Gotti Jr., in a televised interview years later, was asked about his father's involvement in what happened to Favara. He said, knowing John and how he was and how he felt about a lot of things, especially regarding his own children, he probably was. On August 5th, 1980, 1 week after the disappearance, an FBI informant reported that Favara's body would never be found. July 28th, 1980, a Monday. John Favara finished his shift at Castro Convertibles and walked toward his car, which was parked at a diner approximately 2 blocks from the factory. Men were waiting at or near the parking lot. Multiple witnesses were present. He was beaten and forced into a van. The van drove away. One detailed account from law enforcement sources places the abduction near the intersection of Northern Boulevard and King Road at approximately 5:30 in the afternoon, with the witnesses describing what they saw to police as a probable abduction. Witness accounts varied on the specific method of the assault, with some describing a baseball bat and others describing a silenced pistol, or both. The FBI's official account confirms that he was shoved into a van by several men near his place of business. No one ever saw John Favara again. Janet Favara reported her husband missing to police on July 29th, the following day, after he failed to return home. The Gotti family returned from Fort Lauderdale on August 4th, 1980. Detectives questioned them. The hotel receipts were produced. No charges were filed. John Gotti's statement to the detectives: "I'm not sorry the guy's missing. I wouldn't be sorry if the guy turned up dead." Victoria DiGiorgio's statement: "I don't know what happened to him, but I'm not disappointed he's missing. He killed my boy." She later added, "He never sent me a card. He never apologized. He never even got his car fixed." The closing on the Favara house had been scheduled for July 31st. It did not happen. The legal transfer was never completed. The record of what happened to John Favara after the van drove away from that Long Island parking lot is not a single account. It is several accounts, each documented to different degrees, none establishing the full truth to the standard a court of law requires. For years, the dominant theory among law enforcement was that Favara's remains had been placed in a barrel of concrete and dropped off a pier in Sheepshead Bay, Brooklyn. This was based on the known disposal methods of the Gambino family's enforcement operations during that period, not on any direct evidence. In November of 2004, acting on tips from informants connected to a separate Bonanno family prosecution, the FBI excavated a vacant lot in a section of Queens known as The Hole, a remote area bounded by the Belt Parkway that law enforcement suspected of having been used as a mob graveyard. FBI agents wearing yellow rubber boots worked alongside backhoes and cadaver-sniffing dogs. 2 bodies were found and identified. John Favara's remains were not among them. In March of 2001, the journalist Jerry Capezzi, drawing on present and former law enforcement sources connected to the case, published an account that named 8 crew members as having participated in the abduction and killing: Angelo Ruggiero, Willie Boy Johnson, Gene Gotti, John Carneglia, Charles Carneglia, Anthony Rampino, Richard Gomez, and Iggy Alongya. Capezzi's account described Favara's body being taken to a salvage yard in East New York, operated by the Carneglia brothers, where Charles Carneglia disposed of the barrel in the ocean off Brooklyn, and John Carneglia crushed Favara's car at the yard. No one was ever charged on the basis of this account. During the week of January 5, 2009, federal prosecutors in Brooklyn filed a 44-page evidence motion in the racketeering trial of Charles Carneglia, a Gambino soldier then 62 years old who was facing charges on 5 murders and related counts. The motion, signed by Assistant United States Attorney Roger Burlingame, included the Favara case among several uncharged crimes. 2 cooperating witnesses cited in the motion stated that Carneglia had told them he disposed of Favara's body by placing it in a barrel of acid. Carneglia had described acid as the best method to use to avoid detection. One of the witnesses stated that Carneglia had later asked him to help move barrels of acid from his basement, explaining that the barrels had been used to dispose of bodies. Carneglia was convicted in March of 2009 on racketeering charges, including 4 murders, and sentenced to life in prison. He was never formally charged with Favara's murder. The Capezzi 2001 account describes concrete and ocean. The federal court filing from 2009 describes acid. Both accounts draw on informant testimony. Neither was established in a criminal proceeding that included the Favara killing as a charged count. The body was never found. The method of disposal was never established to a legal standard. The record has 2 conflicting informant-based accounts, and no way to resolve the conflict. No one was ever charged with the abduction and murder of John Favara. His body was never found. The record has several accounts of what happened and no way to reconcile them, and after more than 4 decades, it is unlikely to acquire the evidence it would need to do so. John Favara was declared legally dead in 1983, 3 years after he disappeared, with no body, no confirmed cause of death, no charged perpetrator, and no conclusion that any legal proceeding produced. Janet Favara died in 2000 without learning what had happened to her husband. Scott Favara, in an interview in 2004, described the family's enduring uncertainty and the absence of closure that had persisted across nearly a quarter century. Kevin McMahon, The neighborhood boy who had owned the minibike Frank Gotti was riding when he died, and who had appeared at the Gotti door the day after the funeral to ask about payment for the broken bike, appeared in connection with the Carneglia proceedings years later. One account identifies him as a cooperating witness who provided some of the information about Carneglia's disposal methods. If that account is accurate, the boy whose bike Frank Gotti died on became, decades later, a source of information about what happened to the man whose car killed him. When the Gotti children grew up and had children of their own, each of them named one of their sons Frank in memory of their brother. John Gotti was buried at St. John's Cemetery in Queens beside his son Frank in the family mausoleum when he died on June 10th, 2002, of throat cancer at 61 years old, serving a life sentence for murder and racketeering. The cemetery also holds Carlo Gambino, Vito Genovese, Charles Lucky Luciano, and Carmine Galante. The code that governed the world Gotti inhabited held that civilians were not to be killed. Killing a civilian was the kind of act that required explanation, that created exposure, that broke a tacit agreement between the organization and the communities it operated within. John Gotti did not apply that rule to the man who had driven his car home from work on a Tuesday afternoon and hit a child who came out of a blind spot. The police found nothing wrong with his driving. The code Gotti enforced in every other context was the code he set aside for the most personal reason a man can have. The Favara killing appears in the 44-page Burlingame motion from 2009 as an uncharged crime. It is referenced in the documented record as a killing, the evidence supports, but the indictment never named. John Gotti was convicted in April of 1992 on 13 counts of murder, racketeering, and related charges. None of those counts named John Favara. There is no charge in any indictment that names John Favara. There is no verdict. There is the record of what the police found on March 18th, and the record of what the FBI documented in the months that followed, and the record of what cooperating witnesses said in other proceedings about what happened afterward, and none of it adds up to accountability in any formal legal sense. The house on 86th Street in Howard Beach was sold eventually to someone who did not know what had happened in it. The family mausoleum at St. John's Cemetery has two names on it now. John Favara was declared legally dead in 1983, 3 years after the July afternoon when he walked out of the Castro Convertibles factory for the last time, in a state the law could not formally document because the body was not there to document it, and the people who knew what happened were not in the business of confirming it, and the record decades later still has the same gap in it that it had at the beginning, a blind spot in a story about a man who drove into one.